I will present my work in progress, as said. And the starting point here is that in the past 30 years, we've seen 3 times as many international migrants in the world now. And this number is expected to keep increasing. We also know from prior literature that large-scale migration without sufficient contact between natives populations and migrants tends to be associated with tensions in attitudes between these two groups and with a surge in far-right support. At the same time, if contact does take place, natives and migrants do interact, this can improve the attitudes that natives hold towards migrants. But for this contact to take place, they need to share a common space. And in practice, we see across a range of settings that different ethnic groups and nationalities segregate. Here's an example of housing in Chicago, where in purple we see Blacks dominating the central neighborhoods and we have whites further out to the suburbs. But you also see residential segregation, for instance, in France. Think of workplaces. Here are migrant populations in Los Angeles, but we also have similar results in Sweden. And we see in consumption patterns that different groups segregate here, for instance, in restaurant choices in New York City, but we also see in food choices in India and along a range of dimensions, for instance, in the US. So this paper will look at the extent to which natives actively segregate as migrants arrive to their cities in their day-to-day consumption patterns, and what this can tell us about the extent to which natives and migrants might come into contact. I will be looking at the setting in which over 1 million Ukrainian refugees arrived to Poland in only 2 months in 2022 after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which constitutes the largest refugee surge to the OECD area of rich countries since the end of World War II. I will be focusing on the choices of different consumption locations, such as stores, restaurants, and different types of amenities that natives make, and how this changes depending on the local migrant presence around these establishments. I'll be using data from Google Maps, where for every person that I have in my sample, I have the full history of all reviews that they have left on Google Maps anywhere in the world. And I will have this for over 40,000 individuals who are based in Poland. Using this review data, I will also try to understand this migrant presence by computing shares of migrant reviews relative to migrants and natives at various levels, starting from the large commuting zone. So this could be the whole of metropolitan Warsaw, for instance, and down to the very, very local 200 by 200 meter grid cell. I will then, to the furthest extent possible, also validate this with administrative data sources, and I see that the correlation is very strong. With these migrant shares, I look at the number of visits to different consumption establishments that natives make. So is it the case that as migrants arrive to these cities in large numbers, natives might be more inclined to stay home, eat out a bit less, concentrate into fewer purchases? Then at the choice of these consumption locations. So given that they do they change where they go? Maybe going to a neighborhood that has a bit fewer migrants around. And I look a bit at the supply side. So is it the case that where new locations, let's say new restaurants open, interacts with this migrant presence and might help to explain what we see in terms of segregation patterns? To give you a preview of what I find, in terms of the number of visits that natives make, there is no sign that natives reduce their eating out or their shopping in response to this large migrant inflow. They do not stay increasingly at home, but they do shift where they go. A 10 percentage point increase in the very local migrant share at the 200 by 200 meter grid cell level That's about half a standard deviation, so it is a representative change. Such an increase is associated with about 12% less likelihood that the given person goes to a given location, let's say a given restaurant, compared to another one that's available to them. The magnitude here is the same as if you would place that same location, say the same restaurant, 275 meters further away from home. And my results also indicate that this does not seem to be driven by crowding, so just by the number of people around that you might be hesitant to stand in line, but about something about who it is that is around. I also borrow a concept from sociology and urban literature that looks at specific types of consumption locations where social mixing is more likely to take place. So where this exposure might be particularly policy relevant. This includes, for instance, bars and cafes, but it also includes hair salons, for instance. And in these locations that we will zoom in on because we care about them even more, we see actually twice the avoidance response. And furthermore, avoidance is stronger if you have more alternative options around. So if you're going to a given store, if there are many stores nearby, so you can more easily switch, you see that switching happens more often. Lastly, if we have time, we will look a little bit at the supply side. And it does seem that for these places that are most conducive to social mixing, even where new ones open is correlated with what we see on the demand side. So it could be the case that new locations that open tend to disproportionately attract natives more than migrants, and hence reinforce these segregation patterns. Just to give you a little bit of a flavor of what the data looks like before we dig in deeper, the migratory episode, as I said, happened in March and April 2022, largely. Then we have some gross flows, but really over 1 million people arrived in those 2 months. And at the beginning here of that episode, here we see a tiny section of Warsaw, just north of the absolute inner city center. And we see red dots representing Poles reviewing different locations, blue dots representing Ukrainian migrants, and then we have some gray dots for other groups, such as tourists. Overall, in March, you can see that the map is dominated by Polish presence. And to help guide you a little bit, I've put the lower ellipse there. The smaller one is an area with many Poles. And then you have this larger ellipse a bit further away from the inner city center, where there are very, very few individuals present overall. But then 2 months later, with 1 million people arriving to a country of less than 40 million, and a lot of them to Warsaw, you do see more Ukrainian presence, so more blue dots overall in the same cutout. And you see in the smaller ellipse on the lower right that there is more Ukrainian presence, even a bit more than Polish one. And at the same time, you have a lot more Polish presence slightly further away. We're not talking a huge shift, but a few hundred meters further away. In practice, the analysis that I will do will always be with an individual. So we'll always be talking about the same individual making new choices. But just to give you a bit of a flavor. And lastly, I will, in terms of the literature that I speak to with this, many of you will be very well familiar with the rich literature on contact theory, natives' exposure to migrants, and changes in attitudes, which typically tends to have relatively controlled settings. So we have school classrooms or military dorms where different groups come into contact, and we see how attitudes change. And I take a sort of prior step to this. I say, what is the extent to which you can choose not to have this exposure, endogenously sorting away? I will also speak to the growing literature on segregation and consumption patterns, especially spatially, which usually focuses on the United States and on whites and blacks. And here I have this dynamic setting where migrants arrive to cities and natives, the same natives, change in their consumption patterns. I will give you more on the data now, because it is an unusual data source, before first diving into these frequency results. So how common is it that natives go to different places and would they rather stay at home? We saw that's not the case. Then we look at the switching. So which places do you go to and how does that relate to the local migrant presence? And if we have time, we'll take a short look at the supply side as well. So on the data, the core data comes from Google Maps, where I have online reviews of different types of establishments. So stores, bars, public amenities, tourism spots, anything you can find on Google Maps. And for any given user that I have in this data, I have the full panel of everything that they have reviewed across time. This is for over 40,000 users that I have in Poland. And every observation will have the name of the establishment visited, its exact postal address, the content of the review. In the vast majority of cases, I can establish the gender of the reviewer, and then I will have an approximate date stamp. So I will not know the precise point, the precise hour or so when the individual went there, but I will have an exact range of dates, and then I will use the midpoint of that. In terms of the spatial distribution of these individuals over Polish municipalities and districts, this is highly representative relative to administrative sources such as censuses and temporary residence permits. So for both Polish natives and for Ukrainian migrants, we have correlations around 0.8. On the other hand, the sample is more urban and also more male than what the reference populations are. Just to be clear, since for the migrants, you have a huge overrepresentation of females, there were mostly females that left Ukraine, the population of migrants in my sample is also majoritarily female. It's just less majoritarily female. So we still have an overrepresentation of men relative to the reference population. We know from representative survey evidence in Poland that urban Poles and males tend to hold more positive attitudes towards Ukrainian migrants than do more rural Poles and females. So if anything, this should suggest that results might be slightly attenuated. I match this core data also to data on the type, the categories of each establishment. So the largest category will be retail stores, followed by eat and drink establishments, so restaurants, cafes, and bars, and then grocery type of establishments. So this will be grocery stores, but also, for instance, bakers and butchers, places that tend to be very close to home. I also have a very detailed subcategorization, which I will use to flag what in sociology and urban economics would be called third places. So third places are locations. First would be home, second work. Third places are other locations that are conducive to mixing between individuals that did not know each other at the onset. Doesn't mean that they will necessarily like each other, but they will get to know each other and be able to place each other in the social web. So we can think of cafes and bars, but we can also think of, for instance, hair salons and beauty salons. I will need a number of measures based on this data that I compute. Firstly, to get an approximation of where each reviewer lives, I will look at the reviews that they've left for grocery type locations, which would be typically close to home. You would be surprised at how common it is that people review, for instance, grocery stores. And so here I take the center point, so sort of mean of these locations per individual. And then to validate it, I use another measure that's been used in prior literature, which looks at reviews that explicitly mention that this is close to my home. And I see that it makes essentially no difference. It's very, very close in what we find. And from these home points, then, I can compute the distance to any establishment, both the ones you choose and the ones you could have chosen, because of course, distance will be an important factor. Also, since we're looking at natives and migrants, we will need to classify these individuals to know who is a Polish native, who is the Ukrainian migrant, and who might be a third group, like a tourist. And so here primarily take advantage of the fact that I have the full history of reviews for every individual. And this migratory episode that I focused on started with Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. So if a given individual consistently was reviewing in Ukraine before the state, and then consistently in Poland afterwards, I classify them as Ukrainian. There was also a first wave of Ukrainian migration after Russia invaded the East in 2014. So these would be individuals that would be consistently based in Poland before 2022 and also after. But here, I look instead at the language that they use for reviewing. So if they review in Ukrainian or Russian, the two main mother tongues of Ukraine, this would be a very, very strong predictor of them being Ukrainian migrants in Poland. So I flag them as such. On the other hand, if they review consistently in Poland, both before and after, but not in these languages, I will consider them Polish. On the spatial side, most importantly, I need a measure of migrant presence. So I use the share of reviews that Ukrainians have left relative to Ukrainians and Poles, and always excluding the given individual study. So this is always a leave-out measure, which would be very important to avoid bias. And I do so from the very large commuting zone level, so the whole metropolitan region of Warsaw, for instance, often multiple large cities, and down to the very local 200 by 200 meter grid zone, as well for intermediate sizes. As we've said, the spatial distribution corresponds very well with the administrative data sources, but you might still be worried that the migrants that are most likely to review things on Google Maps would be more frequent internet users, more frequent smartphone users, and such. And so I look at survey evidence from the UN, specifically on the Ukrainian refugee population, and I see that these more frequent internet users are more highly educated and have higher income than their peers. And we know from past literature that migrants who are more highly educated and have higher income tend to be more positively viewed by natives. So if anything, this might attenuate a little bit what we see in terms of avoidance.
Artur, can I ask you a question very quickly?
Yeah.
Because I was wondering, why do you define the migrant share this way if you can use administrative data? Because in your second point, you say that your spatial distribution is highly correlated with administrative data. So why not using directly the administrative data?
Very good point. So two things. The administrative data doesn't go local enough. So it depends on which population. For the natives, I can use the census in the year before 2021 down to municipalities. So we would have about 2,800 to 2,500. For the migrants in the second wave, we only have districts of 380, but also it captures where people live. What I capture is where they move around within the city, which is something much more local and dynamic, and which no administrative data source really can capture. So what I look at is whether I at least capture where they live well enough, and that seems to be strongly, like this administrative data and the review data are strongly correlated. For capturing where people move around on a day-to-day basis, hypothetically, the only viable data source would have been really, really good mobile phone data that also has information about whether they are migrants or natives. And this is really, especially in a Polish context, completely out of the question. I've really made a push. So that's why the validation is as far as I can go, but it doesn't allow me to answer my research questions.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. So the main analysis sample then will focus on 2 months leading up to the migratory shock, and then 1 year after. So from January 2022 to February 2023, mostly because here's where I have precise enough date steps to get decent identification. But it's important to mention that I always control for baseline values of migrant shares in any spatial unit for the year 2021. It's just that it's slightly less precise in timing. So this will well account for sorting patterns, for instance, in the first wave. And I will focus on reviews within each person's modal commuting zone, which means that I'm abstracting away from tourism, for instance, which might be driven by very different factors. Also interesting, but different. And so the main outcomes here will be on a sample of almost 500,000 Polish reviews for about 150,000 establishments. To give you another flavor of the data here, to be able to visually see what's going on, I've plotted migrant shares from this review data at the district level. So this, I'm saying, is highly correlated with what we see in administrative sources. And I've done so for the year 2021, so just before the second wave of migration, and for 2022, which is the year that I focus on. And I want you to take away a few different things here. Firstly, there was substantial migrant presence already after the first wave, which then approximately doubled with the second wave. Secondly, you see that individuals are spread out across Poland. So the Ukrainian borders down in the southeast, you see the slightly straight stretch above the hook. And it's not just there. You do see an increase from 2021 to 2022 there, but you also see increases, for instance, in the north as well. So much of the country is treated. Okay, so to get to the first question, if natives increasingly stay at home to avoid migrants in their local, in their cities, I'll be using a Poisson pseudo-maximum likelihood estimator. So I'll be counting the number of visits that each individual makes within category. So we're not comparing a bar to a pharmacy. So it's within the categories that we looked at and within each given month as a function of the migrant share of the commuting zone. And then here it's a little bit tricky because I do every estimation always both without and with accounting for the total number of reviews that I see in my largest unrestricted data in the commuting zone and month, because this gives a sense of crowding. So maybe it's not that these are migrants or Ukrainians, but it wouldn't matter if they are foreign tourists or some other group. We just don't want to stand in line. We don't want to feel claustrophobic. But adding such a control, so keeping the number of individuals fixed while changing the share of migrants, mechanically implies the displacement of natives. So this is sort of bad control. And that's why we don't want to consistently always have that, but rather I will be focusing on whether the main coefficient of interest on the migrant share, the beta 1 here, whether it remains stable with and without this addition of the total number of reviews. So this is for now the best I can do in terms of accounting for crowding, and I'll be very happy to discuss what else could be done to really account for this, because I do control for population density and such when we get to the more local estimations too. It's just that to make the distinction between the residents and where you actually walk. All of these estimations will then be within individual. So it's the same individual changing behavior over time, within category, as we said, and also within calendar month. So we're accounting for national level trends here. And so when we look at the table, we will interpret the coefficients in the following manner. So 10 percentage point increase in the migrant share will be, you can approximately read the coefficient directly, but to be precise, it will be an e to the power 0.1 times this coefficient estimate minus 1, change in the number of these consumption locations that any one individual visits within category and month. So person X goes to a certain number of retail stores in April, okay? In terms of the identifying assumptions, I will focus on the first set because we will need it also for the second analysis. So we have here review data. That's not the same thing as when you went to a given location, right? You might go somewhere without leaving a review. So I borrow a set of assumptions from what Davis and co-authors did in the Journal of Political Economy in 2019, where we need firstly, that individuals only review a given location if they've actually been. Secondly, if a given individual has gone to a given consumption location, she will only review that place once. So even if she goes to the same bar again, she will have left that one review. Thanks to the structure of my data where I have the full history of all reviews for any individual, this is a trivial assumption. But more importantly, conditional on visiting a given location and not already having reviewed it, the probability that you do review it does not vary systematically with the characteristics of the establishment. So to be very concrete, of course, some individuals would be more likely to review than other individuals. And you might be more likely to review a restaurant than a pharmacy, and that's completely okay. You're also probably more likely to go to a place that seems to be of higher quality, of lower price, etc. And that's also completely okay. But once you are in that given place, you specifically within a given category, this could be a story where you're more likely to review if you are more surprised. So you have a certain baseline probability of reviewing, but if you are really shocked, whether positively or negatively, there's more a higher probability of reviewing. As I've hinted at, we won't see much here on the extensive margin. So this table goes from focusing on the full country of Poland in columns 1 and 2 to then gradually zooming in on the top 15 commuting zones in terms of population in columns 5 and 6, where most of the analysis will be based. Odd columns will not have this additional control for crowding, even columns will. But overall, you see here that in terms of the number of visits that natives make to consumption establishments, there's really no indication that they would rather stay at home. On the other hand, we will see more on the intensive margins. So while natives do go somewhere, they go elsewhere, depending on the local migrant presence. Here, I will employ this individual level panel structure. So we have different persons who review different consumption locations across time. So here we have time on the x-axis in my little illustration. You can imagine that maybe red would be retail stores, orange might be grocery stores, purple might be eat and drink establishments. And so you see that the first individual first goes to a retail store, then to a grocery store, then another retail store, etc. I'll be conducting this always within category. Once again, we're not comparing a pharmacy to a bar. And we'll be doing it within individual. So we'll abstracting away from the other individuals, and we'll see how the same individual chooses new locations, for instance, new retail stores over time. And we'll compare each choice that we saw the person making to all of the other options that the individual had available to them. So this individual went on the left to the first retail store, while there were these 4 others in this example that they could have gone to, each choice associated with a certain migrant share, certain distance from home, etc. And we've also said in the identifying assumptions that you do not re-review the same places. So once you've been to the first place on the top left, next time you're choosing, that same place is no longer available to you. So your choice set has been reduced by that one place. And this will continue to be the case. In practice, of course, we have so many more places to choose from than 5. This is just for illustrative purposes. To put it in mathematical form, we will maximize the utility of the given individual visiting the given establishment as a function of the distance in logs to that establishment, the local migrant shares down to the very local 200 by 200 meter level, as well as higher levels. We will have a range of socioeconomic controls for local population density, foreign-born, employment shares, and importantly, we'll have the number of other choices that you have of the same category in those grid cells. So how many other restaurants could you go to? Or how many other retail stores could you go to? We'll control for baseline migrant shares in the prior year, because there is substantial sorting here of the first wave that affects the second wave of migration. And you can imagine that there will be a degree to which being accustomed to migrants changes your main effects. And then as before, we run each estimation both without and with accounting for this total number of individuals. So proxy for crowding here. To read the coefficients in the tables that will come, here a 10 percentage point increase in the migrant share, so about half a standard deviation, is associated with this e to the power of 0.1 times beta minus 1%. Don't worry, I will help you interpret. Change in the odds of choosing a given location, so let's say a given retail store, over other options, so other stores that are available in that commuting zone. In terms of identifying assumptions, we will still need the ones we had before to go from reviews to visits. And we'll get back to a bit of robustness checks. So I will talk more about these assumptions after the core results. This first table has the exact same structure as we had before. So columns 1 and 2 focus on the whole of Poland. And then we gradually zoom in columns 5 and 6 on the 15 largest commuting zones. And what we see then is that this local migrant share is associated with avoidance. A 10 percentage point increase in the local migrant presence around the given establishment is associated with about 12% likelihood, reduced likelihood of choosing this given place. A magnitude that corresponds to the same effect as place increasing the distance from home by about 275 meters to that consumption establishment. We can also do this by category of establishment. So we said the 3 largest categories are retail stores, eat and drink establishments, and grocery type establishments. And we also talked about these so-called third places. So where social mixing is most likely to take place and might be most, and where exposure might be most important. To be clear, third places is not a mutually exclusive category. It will include some subcategories of eat and drink, other subcategories of retail stores, and some others. But we see here that for third places, the avoidance effect is about twice as large as what we saw on average and what you see in column 1. So the same 10 percentage point increase in migrant share is associated with about 24% less likelihood of choosing a given location, or the same effect as placing this location about 600 meters further away. We can also interact the migrant shares with the number of establishments that you could choose from in the area. So how many other restaurants do you have? Or how many other stores do you have? In the first 4 columns, we do that in the very, very immediate vicinity. So how many other places do you have in the 200 by 200 meter zone? And the second set of 4, we do it at the larger 2 by 2 kilometer zone. And we see for third places that the effects are primarily driven by areas which have many options. So you're more likely to switch if you have many consumption establishments of the same type nearby. I validate these results in a number of ways. I look at the extent to which individuals in the sample might be choosing together, creating spillovers, which could bias the effect. That does not at all seem to be the case. I look at leads to see if there might be reverse causality. So we could imagine that Poles behave badly and hence Ukrainians move away, thereby reducing the migrant share. It's actually about the future because these timestamps are not super precise. But we don't see at all that this would be driving these results. We try other ways of measuring where people live, and it doesn't change almost anything. And for instance, we also, I changed the size of these grid cells to see is it really sensitive to using 200 by 200 meters, and it's not. We do see similar effects if we change that size. And since we have a little bit of, yes?
You have around 5 minutes left.
Yes, perfect.
Okay.
Thank you. So yes, since we have those few minutes, I'll do a very quick run through of tendencies on the supply side. So would where places open be correlated with this migrant share? So we're back to the same type of estimation that we did at the beginning, a Poisson type, but now we count the number of new openings of a given category. So let's say retail stores in a given cell, and we look at the full year. So from March 2022 to February 2023, because these timestamps will be a bit imprecise. So I won't say if it's a certain migrant share that affects where entrepreneurs want to open, or if where new locations open disproportionately attracts migrants or natives, but just a correlation with the same types of controls as we had before for local economic environments, and the same type of estimation, interpretation of the coefficients. So what we see then, with the same segregation by category of establishment. Firstly, on average, it's not the very, very local migrant share that matters, the 200 by 200 meter one, but rather the larger zone. Here, having more migrants around, even conditioning on how many individuals overall you have around, is associated with a lot more primarily retail stores. They drive the whole of it. It's not surprising, because you can imagine that new migrants need clothing, they need to furnish their house, etc. But for these third places that we really care about for social mixing, there's also a local negative effect. So more migrants in the immediate vicinity is associated with fewer openings. So what might be happening here is that these new places disproportionately attract natives rather than migrants. And so they, in some sense, contribute to what we see on the demand side in terms of segregation. So that's it. So to conclude, natives seem to shift away from consumption locations as the migrant presence in their neighborhoods increase. And they do so especially for places that are most conducive to social mixing, that we might and policymakers might care about the most. So it's not enough to just have such places where social mixing can take place to fill a city with cafes and bars, because people endogenously sort. We see more sorting if we have many establishments available. So this could be if having more clusters might reinforce these types of sorting. And if anything, we see on the supply side that new places might be reinforcing what we see on the demand side. So there might be room for a policymaker to use active urban planning to stimulate melting pots that attract both natives and migrants. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Artur. Okay, so now we'll proceed with the discussion by Lucille. So, Lucille, you can share your screen if you're ready.
Okay, can you see it?
Yeah,
Yes.
thank you. Okay, so you got 10 minutes.
Yeah, thanks.
Floor is yours.
So I was told not to summarize the paper, but I still wanted to highlight that I think the paper is really well written, and I think, Artur, you've made like lots of effort to be clear on the identifying assumptions and how you might be concerned with some, and you're really transparent in how you want to deal with those concerns. So that makes my job way easier, and I think it was really nice to read. So jumping into the main comments, I think first of all you have like really cool data, and that's the main point. Like I think it's like the question is really interesting, and I think the cornerstone of your paper and the real contribution is thinking about using this data and how you use it. So you have the full history of geography located online reviews on Google Maps. I think maybe I don't know the setting that well, but I was wondering whether Maps is the main online review network. Could you like expand the sample by looking at other like sites, or maybe that would also increase like the representativeness of your sample? And is it similarly used across your two populations? Because if it's like, I don't know, I use Apple, so my review is on Apple Map, and maybe that also might be different, I don't know, across populations.
Yeah.
Then, so again, it's about the selection into that specific people, as you said, and as you like are clear in the presentation and in the paper, it's a subsample of people that do review online, and we might be worried about selection. I think you do a great work of convincing us that the shares of migrants are representative, but I think you do a bit less on showing us that there is some external validity, so more on the polls reaction to the migrants. So the polls that do review online, are they like people that we can think are like the same as every other polls, and that every other poll will react the same way as they do? So you do some work on gender and rural urban splitting. I was wondering whether you could get to other characteristics. Here I'm just throwing out ideas. Maybe it's really, really bad, but I was thinking about maybe age or education that you could get to with maybe the reviews. So I don't know, do some like machine learning on spelling checks in the text associated with the reviews. For the age, maybe younger people go more to restaurants and bars and less to grocery stores. So I don't know if you can maybe do something there. And then, yeah, again, about the fact that you only have those reviews. And I was thinking that often it's angrier people that leave reviews. And so again, those angrier people, will they react the same way as anybody else? And I was wondering whether you could check their overall reviewing mechanisms. Like, are they always like leaving really bad reviews, or is it more balanced? And maybe if it's more balanced, then you're like, you could say something about people that would say to you, oh, it's angrier people, maybe they don't react the same way. So this is more about the selection. And then I think you could do even more with the data, because the data is so cool. And I think for now you only use reviews as a proxy for visit, but I think you could leverage also the rating and looking at maybe the probability of leaving a negative review. Does it increase with the share of migrants? You don't have a lot of revisits, and you actually for now like drop the revisits, but I think it's also something that could be really convincing, especially in your second part, whether you like switch away from some places, because if you can see someone that reviews the same establishment and that the rating drops down after you have like an increase in the population of migrants around or using that establishment, then I think that would be really telling, even if it's like, I understand the sample is going to be really small, but that could, yeah, be really telling. And then I was also thinking that you could maybe leverage the comments associated with the reviews, do some text as data analysis, and see if you have like more aggressive tones with the increase in shares of migrants, or something like that. I think that could be really interesting. Then I think it's more identification-wise. I think you have an exogenous shock that you don't fully exploit yet. So as you said, the maybe diff is going to be hard because the entire country is treated, but maybe with some intensity, you could look into that. And then I would encourage you to think about the shift share. So I know that you put this, so now I'm really going deep in the paper, but this footnote where you say that you can't do this shift share, because I think your point is that you're afraid of the exclusion restriction not holding, because the previous share of migrants is going to affect the exposure of natives to migrants and may change their behavior later on. And I think your shock is random. And if there is no other shock happening at the same time and you control for baseline levels, I think you should be okay. And now you also have some falsification tests that you can try to check whether this assumption does hold. And so I would encourage you to maybe look into that. And some more minor comments. I think somebody must have told you, but you should look into Conley standard errors, because you're doing spatial work at a really like small resolution, and it's likely that your squares influence each other. So you should control for that in the standard errors. And then some more things that would I would love to see would be maybe heterogeneity in between political votes. So if you have like some districts that are more right and some districts that are more left, do you see like it reinforcing the behavior that you observe? And then I think what could be also really interesting would be the evolution over time, because I could see it go both ways. So you have this surge of migrants in your city. At first, you just try to avoid them, and then you get used to it, and so this behavior disappears, or you become more mad about those migrants, and then you just move just further and further away. And I think in terms of policy implications, that would be also really interesting to know. But overall, really interesting work, and thank you for your presentation.
Thank you so much. Very good point. Is it this time to answer a little bit, or is it after Q&A?
Yeah, no, you can discuss a bit the discussion, provide some answers overall, and then we'll collect questions.
Perfect. Yeah, so for instance, so I think it seems to be the main, I mean, I know the Polish context much better than I know the Ukrainian one, but so Google seems to be the main source. There's also more Android use in, I mean, especially Ukraine is a bit poorer. It's not extremely poor, but poorer than France, etc. I do use Apple Maps a bit too myself, but they don't really have their own built-in reviewing service, right? They rather use these Yelp, etc., which are more Americanized. But then on the demographics, very interesting suggestion on spell checks for education. I have not thought about that, and that's absolutely something I should look into. Age, I thought about as well, so it's very hard to get anything precise, because gender, as I explained in the paper, is remarkably easy for me to build a little algorithm around, just because names are so revealing of gender in a Slavic context. Age is harder, so I've been thinking about the same lines as you, as would certain places be more likely to attract a given age group? Same for social demographics. Would you go to a fancy restaurant or to a kebab? So this is definitely something that I'm thinking about, and I agree with you on that. We do not see that there are angry polls reviewing, though. Like, this really surprised me. I expected a bimodal distribution where lots of ones and lots of fives and very few threes. Not at all. Like, very many fives, and then there are many more threes than ones, and I have no idea why that's the case. It's the case for both Poles and for Ukrainians. So we don't seem to have that they complain. And even if I look at the text, so I haven't really done rich Texas data yet, and I agree that I should, but I don't see explicitly people talking about Ukrainians or migrants. This might be because it's only gradually that frustrations have become sort of more accepted to voice. So now we see in the current presidential debate going on that the parties are quite anti-Ukrainian in their positioning. But in the prior election that happened kind of in this period, we did not see that. There was no clear like RN type factor. That's not to say that the parties are not right-wing and kind of generally anti-migrant, but they're just they made an exception for Ukrainians, etc. So while I will definitely look into political heterogeneity, it will be not directly on a dimension that is like pro or anti-Ukraine or something. Everyone is super anti-Russia. Everyone was like somehow trying to support Ukraine. But I think of this as a voting quietly with their feet. At this point, you're not yet allowed to stand and shout hateful things, but you might just be a bit, reluctant. And so you go somewhere else. And so it's the kind of early signal in that sense. But that's absolutely something I should look into more. Shift share, yeah, so it's a bit technical, but essentially, yes. What I'm worried about is that if you've had prior exposure to migrants, then you might react differently to also the national level trends. So you have a lot of migrants around from before, you know them, and then you read about 1 million coming in the newspaper. And so literally that interaction itself might have implications for your attitudes, compared to if you read the same news article, but you've never met a migrant, or opposite. So on the other hand, when I've talked to people about this, there isn't full consensus. So I can absolutely think of it a bit more. And I agree that I need to do more in terms of spatial considerations, standard errors, etc. And definitely over time as well. Thank you very much. Very good comments.
Thank you. Okay, so now we can collect questions from the audience. So the audience can raise their hand. Otherwise, panelists can jump in directly.
Well, if there are no questions, let me ask one. So in the map that you were showing us at the beginning to show us the treatment, how migrants were increasing in some districts in Poland, I could see that in some areas, the share of migrants was actually decreasing. I would like to see if it's possible an heterogeneity analysis separating by these areas and seeing if maybe in those areas where the share of migrants is decreasing, you're getting kind of the opposite effect.
Mirror effects, yeah.
Yeah, like a mirror effect.
Yeah.
You know, I think it would be interesting. And if it's possible, you could do it.
Absolutely. That's a very good point. Yes, you do, even during the year, from month to month, you do have a sort of reallocation. So at the beginning, the prior Ukrainian presence from the first wave is quite predictive of where people go, because they might, for instance, be hosted by someone they vaguely know. And then gradually they gravitate more towards larger cities where there are more jobs, because most of them end up working during this period. Not in the first months, but eventually. So you do see these things happening over time, as well as since Poland is neighboring, it's a bit of a transit country. So you have a lot of them ending up in Germany over time also. So yeah, no, very good point.
So you just mentioned that the Ukrainian refugees can work just after arrival?
Yeah, so the EU as a whole had a special framework for Ukrainian migrants, which was a lot more generous than what's been the case for the Syrians and such. I have a different project where we look at mental health seeking of Ukrainian migrants in Germany. And there, our whole goal is to make them, those who need to, apply for, seek psychiatric help from the public system, because the public system does provide it and pay for it in Ukraine and Russia. That was absolutely not the case for Syrians. So it is very different. Also, Ukrainians have visa-free access to the Schengen area since before. So in the first 90 days, they could move around freely without applying for any permits. Then they needed to apply within that period, they needed to apply for a residence permit. And so those resident permit applications is what I use to try to validate where this second wave is located in Poland. Just that, of course, where you're residing and where you apply for permits, not exactly the same thing as where you go. But yes, so they do work, and they work mostly starting in the fall. So they come in March and April, they start working September, October, around there.
Very interesting. I didn't know they could work so soon.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the presentation, Artur. I was wondering regarding your narrative, if it was possible to understand if people like the natives still live in the same places but simply do not go to the same shops anymore, or is that possible that some relocated inside cities? So maybe it will be on a bigger time frame that you could see such results, but maybe that the remark of Tula is linked with that. If you see that people are going back to cafe and stuff once there are less migrants, it means that they did not move and just changes their place of consumption. But if they do not come back, maybe it's because they simply moved inside the city or even the countryside.
That's a good point. I should look more into this, and I guess I can see if suddenly the distances from this previous home point are huge. But I would say that on average, Poles are very unlikely to move. So they move once every 15 years. That's much less common than, let's say, in a US setting where many of these other papers are. And also, it is a relatively short time frame, as you said. So I don't expect much of this happening, given how stationary Poles are. They're often owning their housing, but I can definitely do more on this, yeah.